This happened 2 years ago, at a time when I loved traveling alone and genuinely believed that being by myself was the best way to clear my head. So I booked a small cabin in the middle of nowhere because I needed a break from people, from noise, from constant expectations, and I wanted a place where no one could call me, knock on my door, or demand anything from me. And the cabin I found online looked perfect because it was remote, but still described as safe. The kind of place meant for hunters, hikers, and people who just wanted peace. I finally reached the cabin. There wasn't even a proper driveway, just a clearing and a small wooden building sitting among the trees, looking abandoned in a way that didn't feel comforting. But I ignored that feeling because I wanted quiet more than I wanted to listen to my instincts. Inside, everything seemed normal. The place was simple and clean. I got the wood stove going, listened to it crackle for a bit, and once the heat finally started spreading, the place felt safe enough. So I spent the evening doing exactly what I came for, eating something quick and letting my brain finally slow down. And by the time I went to bed, I felt that rare kind of calm that makes you believe you're untouchable because there is nobody around to disturb you. At some point I fell asleep, but later that night I woke up because the temperature dropped suddenly. And for a moment I thought the heater had failed, but then I heard something that didn't belong there. A soft, deliberate knock. Not on the door, but on the window. And it wasn't a random sound because it had rhythm and spacing, like knuckles tapping lightly just to see if someone inside would react. And when I heard it again, I sat up fully awake, my heart already beating faster, because the sound came from the side window that faced only trees, and there was absolutely no reason for anyone to be there. I stayed completely still in the dark and listened. And the knocking slowly moved from that window to the wooden walls, like someone was walking around the cabin and checking each side, one by one. And that was the moment fear settled heavy in my chest, because whoever was outside wasn't lost, wasn't rushing, and wasn't calling for help. They were being quiet on purpose, and their footsteps were light enough that I could barely hear them, but steady enough that I could follow their movement as they circled the walls. Honestly, I was confused and scared, but part of me still wanted to understand what was happening, because I consider myself a reasonable person. So I slowly stood up and looked through the window as quietly as I could. There was nothing there. No face, no reflection, no shape. And while I stood there watching, the knocking started behind me from another side of the cabin. Then my worst fear became real when I heard the door handle turn slowly. Not violently, not like someone trying to break in, but like someone calmly checking if it was locked. And when it didn't open, they didn't leave. They moved to the wall beside the door and knocked again. 3 taps, a pause. Then 3 taps again, and the silence between those knocks felt worse than the sound itself, because it felt like they were listening for my breathing, waiting for the smallest sign that I was panicking. That's when I knew I couldn't stay trapped inside, because the longer it went on, the more certain I became that this wasn't random at all. So when the knocking moved to the back of the cabin, I grabbed my keys and jacket, moved as quietly as I could, and swung the door open hard, and the clearing was empty, and the trees were completely still. And for 1 second, I almost believed I had imagined everything. And that's when I understood I had to move immediately. I ran to my car, and the second my hand touched the door handle, I heard footsteps sprinting through the leaves behind me, fast and aggressive. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, locked it, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. Then something hit the side of the car, hard enough to make the whole vehicle shake, and right after that, someone started hitting it. I knew it was with their hands, because they couldn't break any of the windows. At that point, the engine was already on, but I caught movement in my peripheral vision, and when I turned to the left, I saw a man. His face was right there in front of mine, so close I could see his breath fogging the window. He was staring straight at me, and there was nothing human in his eyes, just that focused look. like he'd finally caught what he'd been after. He started pounding on the window over and over because he couldn't break the glass, and in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. If that door opened, I wasn't getting out alive. I was terrified, but at the same time, that survival instinct kicked in. So I started driving. I didn't stop until I reached the first place with lights and other people around me, shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. When I went back the next day with the police to collect my things, they found what actually mattered. Boot prints in the mud circling the cabin, stopping at every window, lingering near the door. And behind the cabin, they found cigarette butts and a crushed energy drink hidden in the brush. Clear proof that someone had been there for a while, waiting and watching. And I still believe the only reason I made it out alive is because I didn't stay long enough to find out what would have happened when the knocking finally stopped. This happened 6 years ago, just after I finished my second year of college, during a short break when I decided to spend a full day hiking alone in the mountains of North Carolina. Something I had done many times before, because I grew up near these forests and always felt comfortable there, especially around a man-made lake and a small cabin that sat deeper inside the woods. A place I had visited before with my family and always associated with calm, isolation, and safety. That morning, I drove a few miles from town, parked on the side of the road like I had done before, and walked straight into the forest, planning to hike for a few hours, reach the lake and the cabin around midday, rest there for a bit, and then head back before evening. Because even though the weather looked fine, I knew mountain conditions could change fast at that time of year. The hike itself felt normal at first, quiet and peaceful. The kind of silence you expect when you go deep enough into the woods. And for the first few hours, nothing seemed out of place, until I started hearing branches breaking somewhere off the trail. Slow and irregular, more like footsteps than animals. But I brushed it off because wildlife was common and I didn't want to scare myself for no reason. Not long after that, I heard a bell ringing somewhere ahead of me. Faint, but clear enough to stand out against the forest sounds. And that made me uneasy because bells don't belong out there, especially not deep in the woods. But the cabin and the lake were close, and I decided to keep going, even though, for the first time that day, I had the strong feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. When I reached the lake and the cabin, that feeling faded for a moment. The place looked calm, familiar, and unchanged, and I tried to relax. But everything changed fast when the sky darkened without warning. The wind picked up, and heavy rain started falling, the kind that soaks you instantly and turns trails into mud, making it clear that hiking back to the car wasn't safe anymore. I decided to stay inside the cabin and wait out the storm, and I sent a message to my mother, telling her where I was and that the weather had turned bad, although the signal was weak and unreliable. And as night came, the storm grew violent, with rain pounding the roof of the cabin and wind shaking the walls, while the forest outside became unnaturally quiet between gusts. Inside the cabin, it was cold because I had nothing to properly warm myself with, but I was still dry, standing there staring into the darkness. And I swear that when you're in a place like that at night, all your senses sharpen, you hear better. Your eyes adjust to the dark, and I ended up huddled in the corner of the cabin, waiting for someone to find me or for the sun to come up. Somewhere after 1 a.m, the rain finally started to ease, and that was when I could clearly hear what was happening outside the cabin. And honestly, it was an absolute nightmare, like being trapped inside a bad dream you can't wake up from, because I heard footsteps moving around. Very quiet and light at first, and then I heard the bell again, which made it clear that something was definitely out there. The bell didn't ring constantly or in any pattern. It came at irregular intervals, sometimes closer to the cabin, sometimes farther away. And I couldn't tell if it was a person moving with it or something else entirely, because nothing about it felt familiar or normal. And then something made my stomach clench, a deep growl. Not like any animal sound I'd ever heard in all the years I'd spent in these forests. I was terrified, listening to the footsteps, the growling, and the bell, knowing that if whatever was outside decided to force its way through the wooden door of the cabin, maybe no one would ever find me, because there was nowhere to run, nowhere to escape, and I was completely on its territory, not mine. For about 3 hours, I heard the footsteps, the growl, and the bell on and off, and I barely breathed or moved, sitting completely still inside the cabin, trying to make it seem empty, knowing that the thin walls were the only thing separating me from whatever was out there. Sometime after 4 in the morning, I finally heard human voices calling out from a distance, clear and unmistakable. And when I realized it was my parents and a rescue team, the fear broke all at once, because they had received my message late and came looking for me immediately. I still don't know why it never came inside the cabin. I don't know if it was trying to scare me into leaving, or if it was just waiting. I have no idea what really happened that night. All I know is that I never went back there again. It wasn't just bad weather, and it wasn't just my imagination. There was something else out there. And whatever it wasn't in a hurry, it wasn't panicking, and it didn't need to act fast. And that's the part that still scares me the most. This happened a few years ago, late November, when I had taken a full week off work and decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time, disappear into the mountains for a few days. Because I didn't need a vacation with comfort or distractions. I needed real distance. Real silence, long hours of walking where your head finally shuts up and you feel like nothing can reach you. The plan was simple. I had marked a small cabin deep in the forest as my first stop. I would hike there, stay the night, and the next morning continue on foot toward another cabin further along the route. A slow, multi-day hike, nothing extreme, just distance, movement, and being alone with my thoughts. The drive there was honestly perfect. Higher elevation, deeper forest, clean, cold air. The kind of road where you roll the windows down, even though it's freezing just to breathe properly. And by the time I reached the parking area, I already felt lighter, like the stress had drained out of me. I left my car there and started hiking, knowing it was about a 5-hour walk through the forest to reach the cabin. No rush, no pressure, just steady movement. The trail itself was beautiful. Quiet, wide enough to feel safe, covered in leaves, with that late autumn smell of damp earth and cold air. And more than once, I caught myself thinking this was exactly what I needed. No noise, no people, no signal, just walking and breathing. I didn't see a single person the entire hike, and that didn't bother me at all. If anything, I liked it, because it felt remote in the best possible way. By the time I reached the cabin, it was already around 6 in the evening. It was smaller than I expected, but not in a bad way. Just one room, a narrow porch, and trees pressed in close on all sides, like it had been built to stay hidden. Nothing about it felt abandoned or broken. It felt maintained, like someone still cared enough to keep it usable, even if they weren't there right now. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Old wood, cold air, and something faintly metallic underneath that I couldn't quite explain. Before it got fully dark, I walked around the cabin just to get my bearings, but there was nothing unusual, just trees and silence. Once the sun went down, I went to bed, mostly because the darkness pressed in hard and there was nothing else to do. And I lay there listening to the cabin settle, the wood popping slightly from the temperature drop, telling myself this was exactly what I came for, isolation and quiet. But after a while, I got that unpleasant feeling, that creeping sense of being watched. Like something was aware that I was awake, and that was when the silence started to feel wrong instead of peaceful. I didn't fall asleep right away, because the cabin felt too quiet in a way that didn't feel natural. And as I lay there in the dark, I heard footsteps at the back of the cabin. I froze instantly and kept everything dark. No lights, no phone screen, nothing. Because the last thing I wanted was for whoever was outside to know exactly where I was. I forced myself to look through the side window just enough to see outside, and my stomach dropped when I saw two dark figures moving from the back of the cabin toward the front, close enough that I could see their shapes clearly. Then I heard footsteps on the wooden porch. Not random creaks, but real steps, slow and deliberate, heavy enough that I could feel the vibration through the floor. They weren't rushing, and that was the worst part, because one of them moved toward the front door while the others stayed back. And it was obvious they weren't lost hikers or random people. They were coordinating, moving like this was planned, like they were enjoying it. When I saw them heading for the door, something inside me snapped, and I knew I couldn't stay inside any longer. So I slowly opened the window on the opposite side, every movement controlled, barely breathing, already planning to climb out and run into the forest while they were focused on the front. I had just started lifting myself up when the cabin doors suddenly exploded open with a loud crack and a slam that shook the whole building. And at that exact moment, I heard shouting, real voices, laughing and yelling at the same time. And one of them shouted, "Get him! He's running! Don't let him get away!" I didn't think anymore. I threw myself out the window, hit the ground hard, got up instantly, and started running as fast as I could along the path I had come from, not stopping, not looking back. Behind me, I could hear them shouting, laughing, yelling things like, "Catch him," and "He's getting away." And it was clear they weren't trying to scare me anymore. They were actually chasing me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were about to give out. And eventually, I left the trail and hid in the woods because I needed the darkness to cover me. I stayed low, hiding behind trees and bushes, barely breathing. And after a while, I saw them again ahead of me on the trail, standing with flashlights, scanning around, clearly frustrated, looking in the wrong direction. I watched them talk for a minute, then turned back toward the cabin, obviously convinced I had gone much farther than I actually had. And I waited a long time after they disappeared before I moved again, just to be sure. Only then did I run toward the parking lot. And when I finally reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away without looking back, not caring that my backpack, my food, and all my supplies were still in that cabin. I didn't care about anything except the fact that I was alive. I got home at dawn, exhausted and shaking, and only then did I feel safe enough to breathe. Because whatever those people were doing out there, the only thing I know for sure is that I wasn't supposed to get away. And the fact that I did still feels like an accident. After that, I never went hiking alone again, and I never slept in a cabin in the woods. This happened about 3 years ago, when I decided to spend a few nights alone at my uncle's cabin. I decided that because it had always felt familiar, a place I'd visited as a kid, a place my body remembered as safe even after years of not being there. And that false sense of familiarity was the reason I didn't question how isolated it really was. Sitting alone deep in the trees with no neighbors, no nearby roads, and no cell service once the sun went down. The first evening passed quietly. The kind of quiet that makes you think you've made the right choice, because nothing moved outside except the wind and the occasional branch shifting, and I went to bed early, relaxed enough that I didn't lock every window, trusting memory more than instinct, believing that if nothing bad had ever happened there before, nothing would happen now. I woke up sometime after midnight because I heard movement outside the cabin. Not loud enough to jolt me awake at first, just enough to pull me out of sleep slowly. And as I lay there listening, I realized it wasn't random, because the sound wasn't coming from one direction, it was circling. Slow steps on leaves, stopping and starting like whoever or whatever was outside was pacing deliberately, not lost, not confused, but aware of the structure and moving around it. And then I heard it. Someone said my name. It sounded exactly like my uncle, and I almost answered without thinking. The same tone, the same calm way. It didn't sound threatening. It didn't sound fake. It sounded normal, like he was right outside the window. And that's when my body locked up, because my uncle wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that cabin, and hearing his voice there made no sense at all. I stayed completely still and listened. And then the voice came again, but this time it was closer, right outside my window. It said my name the exact way my uncle always did. It didn't sound forced or exaggerated. It sounded normal, familiar, like he was just walking around outside looking for me. And that's when my stomach dropped, because it wasn't guessing or copying randomly. It was using his voice the way he actually spoke, which meant whatever was out there had listened someone long enough to learn it. Recorder, the footsteps, because that was the only explanation that made from one side to another. But never rushing, completely panicking, and never tried to break reacting instantly to my movements. When I moved in bed, not after a footstep stopped for a moment, like it was right away. Like whoever was outside could hear every shift I made inside the cabin. You know, grown man scared like the footsteps stopped too. Believe me, this was situation happening only in movies or nightmares. I kept trying to convince myself it had to be a person, someone messing with me, someone with a phone or a recorder, because that was the only explanation that made any sense. But that idea fell apart when the voice started reacting instantly to my movements, not after a pause, not delayed, but right away, like whoever was outside could hear every shift I made inside the cabin. When I stopped moving, the footsteps stopped. When I shifted again, they moved too, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see anything through the windows, but close enough that I knew they were there. After that, I saw a shadow slide across the window, stretched and wrong, way too tall and way too wide, almost not human, cut sharply by the moonlight, like it didn't belong to a real body at all. And that's when it hit me. Whatever this was, it wasn't trying to scare me for fun. It was trying to make me leave the cabin. Then everything went quiet. The kind of quiet that feels fake. And a second later, the cabin shook as something slammed into the wooden walls. Once, then again, hard enough to make the shelves rattle and dust fall, like it was testing how solid the place was. And in that moment, I honestly didn't know where safety even was anymore, because outside felt like a trap, but inside suddenly felt like a cage. I didn't leave because I couldn't. I stayed exactly where I was, sitting in the dark, fully awake, barely breathing, listening to every tiny sound, every creak, every shift of the wind, while hours dragged by so slowly it felt unreal. At some point, sometime before sunrise, the sound stopped completely. No footsteps, no whispering, no movement at all. Like whatever had been out there had finally lost interest or decided to wait. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed there for hours, waiting until I was sure nothing was standing there. That's when I grabbed my things, opened the door, and left without looking back, getting into my car and driving away. I never stayed there again, because once you spend an entire night listening to something try to pull you out into the dark, you stop believing that silence means safety, and you stop believing that being alone really means you're actually alone.